All right, y'all. This lecture will take you through really the first two sections of the chapter 14, text and Strayer, really focusing on how Europeans entered the Asian trade markets in the 16th century, 17th century, and then into the silver trade, which at the end of this video, you're going to answer questions as you watch this, but at the end of the video, you will deal with the DBQ that deals with the silver trade. And you're going to look at the effects of that silver trade. Okay, so if you have questions about this, about what you watch, bring them to class on Thursday or next week, and we can parse through them. In any case, enjoy your learning today, and get after it. All right, y'all, let's get into it. After watching this lecture, you're going to be able to define and compare the various features of European trade and empires in Asia, and you're going to be able to define the effects of the silver trade on the global market. Now, we got to start somewhere. So we're going to start with Portugal. And when the Portuguese made it into the Indian Ocean and entered the Indian ports, they soon discovered that their goods were not in demand and they did not have the cash to buy the Asian items they desired. The Asian ports and the Asian economy as a whole were also much wealthier than the Portuguese or other European economies. You got to keep in mind that Asia's kind of got it going on right now economically. However, they also realized that Indian Ocean trade was generally unarmed, and the Portuguese are like, okay, I got this. Thus, they started to use their extremely maneuverable ships, cannons, to attack merchants and ports, taking what they wanted, and they established a trading post empire. So these Portuguese controlled ports in East Africa, the Persian Gulf, India, Southeast Asia, and China, gave them entry into the Asian economy. And unlike the Spanish annexation of large tracts of land in the Americas, the Portuguese only seized that string of ports. And from these ports, they tried to create a monopoly by creating what was called a Cartaz pass system. They forced merchants at the barrel of the cannon, I might add, to try to create a trade monopoly. And while this did make the Portuguese wealthy, they never established anything near to complete control of the Indian Ocean. The Portuguese realized that the real money was to be made not in exporting goods to Europe, and definitely not in trying to sell European goods in Asia, but by becoming a player in the existing Asian trade. Portuguese's many successes, they would fall away. Partly because their trading post empire was poorly run, and partly because European powers began to make efforts to move into the Asian trade network. Second entry, Spain. Now, Spain posed the first challenge to the Portuguese spice trade. As the Spanish saw that Portugal began to generate wealth from the trade, keep in mind Spain kind of surrounds Portugal, and some of the wealth that was being generated by Portugal was found in Spain through the trade of those goods. The crown of Spain renewed efforts to establish a trade connection with Asia, and in comes Columbus, right? Now, after Columbus's, I guess, unsuccessful voyage, I mean, he didn't find Asia, he found the, I guess, continent of the Americas, or two continents, depending on how you wanted to define a continent. They started to look for other routes. And this was a fascination of many European countries. Let's find a route that goes from Europe to Asia through the Americas. And really, there isn't one. There is now the Panama Canal, but back then there wasn't one except to go around South America or into the Arctic, but the Arctic's frozen, so cool. And so Ferdinand Magellan, between the years 1519 and 1521, completed the first world voyage, or I should say his officers completed the first world voyage because he died in the Philippines. Now, it was that contact with the Filipino archipelago that the Spanish started to realize, oh, this is close to China. This could be good for us. And as the islands had no central government, as the Spanish came in with force and the pageantry of the Catholic Church, they were able to win over many of the local leaders, and really did so relatively peacefully. The Spanish became extremely successful in spreading the Catholic faith in the Philippines. And, you know, this is certainly a goal of the Spanish Empire, was to spread Catholicism. But that led to some disputations with the traditional Filipino culture. You know, particularly the role of women and a push towards larger settlements around a church rather than in isolated villages. Now, more importantly for the wealth of the Spanish Empire, the port city of Manila in the northwest part of the islands became the focus of Spanish activity. Located close to the ports of southern China, more than 20,000 Chinese came to live in Manila. Spanish galleons would carry silver from the South American continent, and it would serve off as a jumping off point to the Chinese ports and trade with China. But with that influx of Chinese, tensions arose over the poor treatment by the Spanish, resulting in revolts and massacres, such as the one in 1603, in which the Spanish killed some 20,000 Chinese. Now let's bring in the Dutch and the British. The British and the Dutch represented a new threat to the Iberian trade in Asia. And you're wondering, what's Iberia? It's Spain and Portugal, the peninsula on which they sit. So the northwestern Europeans, again, the British Isles up here and the Dutch sitting basically seaside on the north coast of Europe. They benefited from superior organization of their capital resources as well as their efficient and ruthless military capabilities. In the 17th century, the Dutch in particular posed a major challenge to Portugal as they forced their way into the Asian trade. Now, it must be made clear that it wasn't necessarily the Dutch government. It was a joint stock company called the VOC, or as we know them in the English language, the Dutch East India Company, led in part by Jan Peeters and Cohen. And if you want more information on this business, this company, which would become the largest in history in this period of time, John Green's got a great video on the Dutch and capitalism that's linked in the discussion post 3.1. Now, the Dutch displayed their organization, determination, ruthlessness when they seized the Spice Islands in order to establish a monopoly of cloves, mace, and nutmeg. Sounds like a pumpkin pie to me. Now, one of these islands, the Banda Islands, or a series of islands, the Banda Islands, the Dutch killed, enslaved, or let starve some 15,000 inhabitants. Not a good thing, right? They destroyed the crops of farmers who would not cooperate with their planned monopoly. And that just really emphasized the fact that the Dutch were in it for wealth, not necessarily any sort of relationship with the indigenous peoples. Taiwan also experienced a similar effort by the Dutch, although they would be less successful in taking Taiwan over. When they took control of the islands in 1624, they found the local population insufficient for labor and encouraged migration from China. However, through this co-colonization with China, the Chinese population grew and the Chinese Empire basically expelled the Dutch in 1662, making it a Chinese province. And that hasn't been a problem whatsoever in world history. Now the British. The Dutch really clamped down on the spice trade. They were not only able to take spice away from the Portuguese, they also kept the British out of it. And the British, they started to focus their activities on India. And in India, the British were faced with the powerful Mughal Empire. It's one reason why the Portuguese never really made inroads in India as well. So I had to stop really quick and realize I said Mughal. It's Mughal. Mughal. The Mughal Empire. So the British worked with the Mughals and established trading posts in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. And the British merchants really worked to import cotton textiles for their home economy. And this would be a feature of the British Empire in India, the production of cotton and textiles. Now, like the Portuguese before them, the British and Dutch discovered that they could make more money in the inter-Asian trade carrying goods from one place to another. They also began to ship in bulk items like pepper, textiles, tea, coffee for mass market. Think like Costco on the high seas. Later, these trading posts would become former colonial possessions, and we're talking years down the road. Now, in total, what effect did the Europeans have on Asian commerce? It's honestly limited. Historians frequently stress new changes and can forget existing patterns and continuities, and that's no difference here. Asian trade remained largely an Asian affair. Europeans really only controlled a few pieces of territory in the islands of Southeast Asia, and the powerful states of the mainland had nothing to fear from these small European fleets. Keep in mind, the Ming, the Mughals. I keep thinking Harry Potter on that one. I have no idea. It's spelled Mughal. Even Siam, which is now in the present day Thailand, they expelled troublesome French missionaries and colonists in 1688. So Yeah, Europe's not making inroads like they had in the Americas in Asia. Now, another interesting facet of trade in Asia is Japan. And when a civil war among the various daimyo lords wreaked havoc in the 16th century, many Japanese welcomed Europeans as sources of trade, new weapons, and a new faith. They initially won 300,000 Japanese as converts to Christianity. But when a series of military leaders got the upper hand and established under the Tokugawa shogunate, they expelled the foreigners, executed the Japanese Christians, and forbid the Japanese from traveling abroad. Only the Dutch were allowed to trade with the Japanese, and that was only because they were Calvinists and weren't about proselytizing and conversion. And even then, they were only allowed to enter a single southern port once a year. So let's talk about silver. So in the 16th century, large silver deposits were discovered in Japan and what is now Bolivia. And this set in motion a new and dynamic phase in world economic history. Now, it's that silver that came from Bolivia, in particular the Andes. It's that silver that came to dominate the global trade, much like Tom Brady has dominated the Super Bowl over the last 20 years. And some estimate that roughly 85% of the world's silver came from the Spanish-American colonies. And it wasn't just Bolivia, it was Mexico too. And Spanish pieces of 8 were a standard coin around the world. Much of Spain's silver flowed west to Manila, where it was then spent on Chinese goods before it made its way into China proper. Silver that went toward Europe was frequently spent on Asian imports. Any way you cut it, it was going to Asia. Now, one of the reasons why silver was in such demand in Asia was because of China. A government decree declared that a centralized tax would be paid in silver. And so China started to suck up the world's silver, so much so that it became known as the world's silver sink. But that production of silver came with a cost. High in the Andes, Potosi became the most important Spanish silver mine. The city itself had fabulous wealthy elite and a massive impoverished population of laborers. And conditions were so bad in the mines that slaves were used and locals who were drafted into the mines were given a funeral before they left home. This is tough stuff. It was said that when these indigenous laborers went down in the mine, very few ever came back out. And the impact of the mining industry was devastating to the local environment, causing pollution, deforestation, and flooding not just the indigenous people themselves. And this was one of the areas in which the Spanish exploited the mita system, the system of labor that the Incas had set up previously. Now, ironically, the Spanish discovery of a massive silver mine had a long-term damaging impact on Spain. Silver generated inflation, and the Spanish production could not compete with imports. Furthermore, the Spanish elite were aristocratic and disdainful of entrepreneurial activity, and Catholic fundamentalism did not welcome Jewish and Protestant merchants into the country. Once the price of silver fell in the 17th century, Spain quickly lost its dominant role within Europe. And Spain wasn't alone with problems that silver caused. The influx of silver caused inflation around the world, destabilized many societies, leading to a general crisis from Europe to Southeast Asia. And the one bright spot here is Japan in terms of its silver management, right? Japan did a much better job of managing the impact of silver. The military leaders used the silver to win the Civil War, establish order, close the borders, foster alliances with merchants, and protect the remaining forests. Remember, I said that 85% of the world's silver came from the Spanish Empire. A lot of the rest of the silver was generated from the islands of Japan. Couple that with the idea that the Japanese population took measures to lower the birth rate. These moves really averted an ecological crisis and fostered a flourishing commercialized economy. And it laid the groundwork for what would come in the 19th century with their modernization efforts that brought them into the modern globalized society, where previously, because of their closure to trade with foreign nations, they hadn't been. Now, in China, with the government demanding silver for taxes, the Chinese population became increasingly entrepreneurial and commercialized. Many regions began to specialize their agricultural or craft production for export to a commercial economy. And unfortunately, this economic dynamism took a heavy toll on the forest and signaled an impending ecological problem that blocked further growth. one could say that they were headed to collapse, and they would eventually get there. But it certainly does fit that diamond framework of what causes a society collapse, ecological devastation. And really what we see as a result of this move towards a more globalized system of trade, particularly with silver, is the center of trade exists in Asia. Europeans could not outproduce their Asian rivals. The Spanish elite in the Americas bought Chinese silk for substantially cheaper than Spanish silk. British consumers preferred less expensive Indian cottons to British textiles, and the writing was on the wall. Asia would be the center of trade in this time and period.